Ladies and gentlemen, now in the Rally Point tent, we have the Air and Space Force Association sponsored 4-star Vietnam Veterans Panel Discussion. Sitting on the panel, Vietnam Veterans General Ron Fogleman from the United States Air Force, Adm Thad Alan from the United States Coast Guard, Adm Mike Mullen from the United States Navy, General Denny Reimer, United States Army, and the first ever National Guard 4-star General Craig McKinley. Please welcome the Vietnam Veterans 4-star discussion panel.
We'll try this one more time. On behalf of the Air and Space Forces Association, we'd like to welcome you to this 4-star panel. I think it represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. All the gentlemen you see behind me are Vietnam veterans and rose to the pinnacle of their individual services. And they've agreed to come today and talk about the legacy of Vietnam as it applies to their individual services. General Allen was over there at the same time where I was. He was running one of our key navigation systems that enabled the air campaign to be so effective. It was called the RAN-C. You can think of it as the earthborne equivalent of GPS. And he finished his career as the Commandant of the Coast Guard. Next is General Ron Fogleman. General Fogleman had 2 tours in Vietnam as what we call a fast FAC. This is a forward air controller. Their job was to find the bad guys so the bombers know where to drop and to coordinate rescues of our crews that got shot down. Matter of fact, he got shot down once himself but was rescued and finished his career as Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. Next, General Craig McKinley. Now, then Lieutenant McKinley was in pilot training when the war ended. So he finished out his time and then got into the Air National Guard, where he became the first guardsman to achieve 4-star rank, serve on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as Chief of the National Guard Bureau. Next to him is General Denny Reimer. General Reimer is an artilleryman, but in typical military fashion, they sent him to Vietnam as an infantry officer. And then he had another tour as an advisor to the Vietnamese Army. And he finished his career as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Next to him is Adm Mike Mullen. He's our naval guy. Navy, what's Coast Guard? That's Coast Guard.
You call them general.
Pardon me. This is Admiral. And it's supposed to be capital ADM. I learned that too. Adm Mullen was one of those guys that did the market time stuff, trying to keep the bad guys from coming ashore and up the Mekong River and all that kind of stuff in his tours in Vietnam. And then he survived all that, became Chief of Naval Operations, and finished his career as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel.
Thanks. Thanks, Landon. Thanks to you and the association for organizing all this. This is, as I expect for a lot of people, this brings back a lot of memories. And I think it really is important to celebrate and to focus on the welcome home piece, because I think all of us know that that didn't happen, at the end of that war. And that's really the main focus here. Some of what we're supposed to do here is talk a little bit about our service in the war. I was actually a young officer, an 02 Lieutenant JG on a destroyer, my first deployment, and I happened to have the watch the day we pulled onto Yankee Station, and all I see is carriers on Yankee Station launching aircraft, and to support, obviously, forces ashore. And it had been, this is late 1969 till early 70. And obviously that had been going on for some time. It wasn't very long, a day, that we were operating in that area, and one of the carriers dropped a helicopter in the water, and we were able to pick up that helicopter and rescue everybody that was there. What I took away from those first few days was just the intensity of the operations. They were enormously intense and focused. And at that time, certainly we all thought very, very impactful. But what I spent most of that deployment on was up at the DMZ in fire support, our artillery support. We used to, in the Navy, we call it gunfire support. And as a young officer, I was in the watch center where we basically, we were an old destroyer, World War II destroyer, USS Colette DD-730, and 3 5-inch 38s. They were not automatic in any way, shape, or form. We had roughly 700 rounds or 500 rounds, I can't remember, in the magazine, if you will, something like that. And we fired those guns until they melted. It was thousands. We would fire a couple thousand rounds. We would go back to sea, reload basically the magazines, underway replenishment from ammunition ships and other store ships, and then come back. And we did that day after day, week after week, month after month, until literally until we wore the guns out. There were, again, 5-inch or 120s. We had to go back to Subic Bay, which didn't break our hearts to go back to Subic Bay, but we had to go back to Subic Bay to really regun the guns. The level of intensity, again, same thing, because that, and I hardly, honestly, at the time, as a young officer, I hardly knew where Vietnam was on a map. I didn't really know a lot about what we were doing there. I was a young officer just trying to do my job, figure out how to get qualified, how to sleep, eat, and keep sustaining that firepower, which we did. Fast forward, actually, a year later, after I came back, I was on another ship in 1972, headed there from the East Coast, because we were running out of 5-inch guns, and got very close, actually got relieved at the end of that. But that mission, and Len mentioned market timing, that's a lot of what the Navy did. The memories for me of that time, I lost one of my best buddies who was a Marine, Teddy Bevilacqua, whose name is right over here. In early '69, I went to Boise State with him in California. I also lost a classmate named Spence Dry, who was a SEAL at the time, in a classified mission that we never really understood until years later. And clearly those things, those missions, and we did them for years and years and years, were very much a part of what the Navy did. And then I'll fast forward just briefly, because I've got the mic for a second. But when I was chairman, we spent an awful lot of time, too much time, my wife and I, too much time in Arlington. We buried too many tremendous young Americans over there. We made too many trips to Dover to engage the families that were there. And part of the reason, and I wanted families to know that there was a human being, a face to put behind this big machine, if you will, that was sending our young men and women off to war, and too many of them were not coming back. And the reason I bring that up is because the scars of our youth, if you will, the scars of that Vietnam era, my own time frame, I brought with me. I have them today, and that drove me tremendously when I was chairman in things like this. When we opened up Dover, quite frankly, that was important, because I wanted America to understand what we were doing, what the sacrifice was, and for America to say, we will continue this or we won't continue this. There was that aspect of it. The other thing is, I was with too many Gold Star moms and dads, brothers and sisters, and we looked at, which is why this is so important, and one mother from the 116th the National Guard out in Boise, Idaho, looked at me and just said, "Please make sure that we never forget my son's sacrifice." Please, and I can remember her words as if she were here today. And so that's a commitment that we had. And throughout those funerals and all the times at Arlington, I met countless Vietnam veterans who were there, and so many people said to them, "Welcome home," then. And I can tell you the number of times tears welled up in their eyes, because it was the first time they ever heard that. That's how important that is. So for all of you who participated in that war, and for all of your sacrifice, your losses, I'm one that I feel privileged to still be here and to be with these gents but from the bottom of my heart, welcome home, and believe me, we'll never forget. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Denny Reimer, and as you already know, I've been introduced as an infantry officer parading as an artillery officer, masquerading as an artillery officer. That's true to some extent, but that was Vietnam. I spent 2 tours in Vietnam. One as a battalion advisor to the Arvin Infantry Battalion, and the second as a member of the 9th Infantry Division, also stationed in the Delta. I would be very remiss if I didn't single out the Army in terms of the number of people who have served in Vietnam. I know all of you have, but there were about 1,763,000 soldiers who served in Vietnam. 58,000 of them didn't come home. There's no way that the nation's going to be able to say thank you and how much they appreciate what you did. But there is no way the nation should ever forget, as Mike mentioned, that you went over there and you sacrificed. That's something that we've got to make sure we never let them forget. Events like this, I think, help people remember what happened over there, and it's really important that we don't forget. My premise is that what happened in Vietnam really helped shape the Army of today, and I'll take you through a couple of things that I think are really important. When the war was over, when the peace treaty was signed, the nation had already signed up for a volunteer army. We didn't know what size it was. We didn't know what's going to be the capabilities of it, but we knew it was better than the draft army, and that was in place. It was a daunting task to try to figure out how to move from that draft army into a volunteer army. General Abrams, Creighton W. Abrams, was the next to the last commander of the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam. He was now the Chief of Staff of the Army when it was all over. He made it pretty easy for us because he said, and he reminded us, that the Army is not made up of people. The Army is people. That small difference makes a huge, that small difference in wording makes a huge difference in terms of how you react to that. We faced a number of challenges when we came out of Vietnam. As Mike alluded to already, the relationship between the military and the civilian world was not good at all. When I came back from Vietnam, reported into San Francisco on my second tour, they told me I couldn't wear my uniform. I had to change into civilian clothes. It was too dangerous. I said, let me get this right. I've been in a war zone. All I've worn is my uniform, and now it's too dangerous. So we had the task then of strengthening the relationship, making it better. Each of the services did different things, the air shows. We participated in sending people to colleges to try to explain what's going on. We changed that around, but it was because of the hard work of a lot of people who spent a lot of time on it, and thank God that they did. We also learned that it was important to have trained and ready people out there. And here again, the experience in Vietnam really helped us figure out what to do. We did not have a non-commissioned officer corps in Vietnam. It was not the fault of anybody that was serving over there. It was just the system hadn't trained them. We set out to make sure that the non-commissioned officer corps was well trained. We used 3 words to describe what we were trying to do: be, know, do. Be a leader, know what a leader does, and do it. I think the training that they went through probably makes them the best trained non-commissioned officer corps in the world. And that was really, really important. We also faced the challenge of how do we react with each other? We had 3 components in the United States Army. One was the active, guard, and the reserve. The active carried the biggest part of that load in Vietnam, primarily because the guard was not mobilized. And we didn't need many of the reserve component. We had that pretty much in hand with the units we sent over there. But the fact that we didn't mobilize the guard made us a much weaker organization than we should have been. I know my battle buddy sitting on my right will talk a little bit more about that, and rightfully so. But in my opinion, that was a wrong decision from the military standpoint. We also figured out that mission clarity was important to us. When we were over there, nobody could tell me what the mission that we were on was. And we just figured that mission clarity, we have to have that whenever we are using force. And so we focused a lot on mission clarity, making sure that everybody understood what our mission was and made sure they were trained for that mission. But we also found that mission was not enough. My Lai taught us the importance of values. As bad as it was, the good thing that came out of My Lai was the values that we introduced into the United States Army. Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Those values are still in place right now, and we talk about mission-focused, value-based. And I guess finally I would end by saying that the experience in Vietnam was so formative for us, and it made us a much better organization. I think Operation Desert Storm, winning the Cold War, all validated that for us. We were a good force at that particular point in time. Today's Army faces different challenges, but again, they're going to go back to what we did in Vietnam, figure out the lessons learned, and implement them. I am convinced that they will be able to meet all of those challenges. They're good people doing a good job, and we just have to make sure we give them the resources, we support them wherever we can, and let them be the best that they possibly can be. So I guess I would finish by saying I am honored to have served with all of you in Vietnam. I appreciate what you've done. I am thankful for your service. And I'd like to close by seeing how many Army people are out there. How about giving me a big Army hula on 3? 1, 2, 3, hua! I'll pass the baton.
Chairman, Chief, and Commandant, it's great to be with you on this panel. It's a pleasure to be back together again. You never know how many opportunities we have to sit here in front of a great audience and tell stories. And I had a chance earlier today to see the Vietnam fighter aces and remarkable stories of men who pretty much gave it their all. And every service represented up here has stories like that, but it was an honor to be part of that. You know, General Reimer talked about the political mood of the country in the 60s. And most of us who grew up in the 60s know it was a very contentious time, just like we may be going through right now. So I've kind of seen this movie before, and I was a college student going through the ROTC program in Dallas, Texas. We had 3 assassinations, and we'd had a bunch of disturbances, and we'd had political parties riot in Chicago, and I was trying to figure out, you know, how am I going to fit into a military when the country is so divided? And I was ready to go to Vietnam. I was almost through flight school like some of you were, and felt like that was our duty because we grew up with parents and grandparents who fought in World War II. My grandparents fought in World War I. And that greatest generation never really let us forget what it means to have civic values and moral values and to be a citizen of the United States of America. And so I didn't really realize it at the time, but there was a lot of things politically going on in this city that kept the men and women who were part of the National Guard at the time home. I remember Ray Odierno in the tank one day asked me, McKinley, when was the last full mobilization of the National Guard in history? And Ray was a historian, and I knew we'd had units called up, but it was really World War II, the last full mobilization of every National Guard, Army and Air Force, man or woman. And so we hadn't really done much of that. Korea, Vietnam, wars of national interest, not wars of national survival, different cup of tea. I felt that Ray tipped me off during the middle of Iraq and Afghanistan that there was going to be a lot more of this going on. So I'll talk a little bit about that later, and I thank General Reimer and General Fogleman for training, organizing, and equipping a National Guard so that we could be relevant, not be so much of a strategic reserve, but become an operational reserve, along with the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard Reserve, who all do great work with the Air Force Reserve. But the National Guard was built on a little different foundation, where it actually did its job at home in natural disasters and civic relief. And then when times were tough, they could be called up and augment and go fight and win our nation's wars. So General Fogleman asked me to ask one of our Misty Facts, who I learned a lot from, Don Shepard, kind of to reflect on his tours in Vietnam. Don Shepard's a brilliant guy who's written books, and these are his words, so I give him credit to it. He said, and I quote, "But in the Vietnam War, President Johnson made a political decision not to use the National Guard and other reserve units because he feared it would cause war hysteria, and he was concerned that it would drain resources potentially from his great society civil rights efforts." Further, he said, unpopularity of the war and the draft led President Nixon to end the draft and stand up the all-volunteer force in 1973. The all-volunteer force has seen the Guard, out of necessity, becoming operational, not just strategic and sitting at home on the shelf. The Guard is now a necessity in any military operation, requiring it to take regular rotations and military deployments in all theaters worldwide, in addition to its duties to conduct the National Air Defense Alert Mission, which we call in the Air Force Noble Eagle, and to respond to state emergencies. Now, that's a grand statement. It took a lot of effort on the part of everybody at this table to make sure that the men and women that we sent to those large-scale operations could come home alive. Some did not. We had a number of Army Guard units that augmented or filled in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. A good friend of mine in Hawaii, who's now retired, said the height of the Army National Guard's participation in the Vietnam War was 1969. In addition to the 2,729 soldiers that deployed in '68, approximately 4,000 more soldiers from the 29th Infantry Brigade from Hawaii and the 69th Infantry Brigade from Kansas deployed as individual augmentees. That kind of was the model back then. We took people where we needed them, we filled into the active component formations, and that was our role. And so we did have a number of Army National Guard soldiers. And then on the Air National Guard, we had 4 Air National Guard fighter squadrons who flew F-100s. Back in the time, those were older airplanes, but they still were relevant and they were put to good use. They were based all over Southeast Asia. Colorado went, Iowa went, New Mexico went, and New York went in the F-100. We had KC-97 units, which were tankers that predeceased the KC-135s, but they had a speed problem. They couldn't necessarily go fast enough to get the F-105s or the F-100s to follow them because they couldn't go that fast. So this is that train, organize, equipping thing that makes us relevant today. So finally, my final statement, which I think is pretty cool, because I think I need to teach my kids and my grandkids a little more civics. I didn't realize that 9 million Americans served in the military during the Vietnam War. 9 million. That's tremendously large in my mind, thinking that we've done Iraq and Afghanistan, which are much smaller Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard. 3.4 roughly Southeast Asia, 2.7 were in Vietnam, some were in Korea because the Pueblo incident, the North Koreans took a ship, so we had to send some augmented units into Korea during that time. And so I think what I'm here to say today, as the other gentlemen have and will say, is I was honored to serve. I am still honored to come to meetings like this and look at young men and women and people who are our age and thank you for what you do. And I never take for granted that this country, I think Jim Mattis may have said this, there's no God-given right that this country will survive. We have to fight for it. We have to want to win it. And we have to do our part. And I commend everyone in here who has done their part. Thank you very much.
Well, my name is Ron Fogleman, and I was a fighter pilot in Vietnam in 2 tours. My first tour, I flew F-100s. And I ended up with a total of 315 missions between that tour and the second tour. And I was shot down down in South Vietnam. The F-100 was the primary air-to-ground airplane in those days. That was the airplane that really supported the Army. But if you stand back and look at our tasking for today, which is, so what was the lasting legacy of Vietnam on our services? I would start by saying that, first of all, you had the United States Air Force engaged in Vietnam in a very, very big way. You had the air arms of the Navy. The Navy kept 2 carriers on station throughout the war. You had the air arm of the United States Marine Corps, was flying off of those carriers primarily, although they had some permanent bases. And you had the Army in what was really the first helicopter war, if you will. And I get a little dewy-eyed walking by these helicopters. When I got shot down over there were no Air Force rescue choppers could get into the area I was at. And so a couple of Army chopper pilots flying the smallest, skinniest airplane I ever saw showed up, and I ended up riding out on a Cobra. And so you look at that Cobra out there and you don't find a lot of handholds. But anyway, those were the assets, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. But I would tell you that air power was degraded in Vietnam. It never reached its full potential. And that was because of primarily 2 reasons. And you had to identify these before you could then go ahead and fix it. And that's what became the legacy, fixing this. The first was we didn't have the right equipment. At that time, we didn't anticipate fighting the kind of war that we did in Vietnam, and we were equipped to fight a nuclear war. And that included aircraft off the carriers, that included our tactical fighter bombers that we had in Europe, 100s, 105s, all of this. So equipment was a problem. The Vietnam War, we did not have a air superiority fighter. And like it was the first helicopter war in a sense, it was also the first war of air-to-air missiles. 50% of the missiles that were fired by United States Air Force crews in Vietnam failed to function. And we had a kill ratio of firing 11 missiles to get one MiG shot down. So equipment was an issue. But a bigger issue, and this is really where our Air Force went to work, I think, is we either ceded to or the North Vietnamese developed sanctuaries that, quite frankly, we were not prepared to handle. The first of those was a political sanctuary, and for this, for political reasons, there were places that were just off the chart. We were not allowed to attack Haiphong. We were not allowed to hit the North Railroad coming down from China. And so instead of taking things out at the port, we allowed them to distribute them and take them to the south. But that was a political constraint, and we today will always operate with political constraints. But where we really went to work was on the others. And the first of these was an integrated air defense system. This was the first time we had run into an integrated air defense system that had surface-to-air missiles, AAA, and MiG aircraft. And we were not prepared to fight in that kind of an environment. The second sanctuary, or the third, was night. We were just not good at night operations. We weren't looking to do that. So in the South, I've dropped many a bomb under a flare by a special forces camp. Not an ideal piece of equipment. The other was weather. We were fighting an area where you had monsoons, and trying to operate in and under the weather with the equipment he had there was real difficult. And finally, we were fighting in a country where there was a jungle, foliage, and so it was hard to pick out things that were moving down there. So what happened is we did not have a dedicated air-to-ground airplane. Neither the Navy or the Air Force had a dedicated air superior airplane. So the leadership, the United States Air Force, and I was not part of this, I was too junior, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, set about to take these sanctuaries away from any future enemy. So what did we do with integrated air defense? Stealth. Stealth and electronic warfare made a big difference. In terms of night, it was a series of sensors. The lantern pod that we developed, light, night infrared navigation and targeting pod, and other sensors. Weather, GPS. You know, now all you need to know is the coordinates. You don't care what the weather is, you're going to drop on it. And there were developed during the Vietnam War some precision-guided munitions, radar-guided munitions, things like this. But they were always hampered by these sanctuaries. And finally, you had foliage, and there we ended up with millimeter wave radar and moving target indicators. But the United States Air Force, the United States military, went to work in the 70s and 80s to close these sanctuaries. And so when the first Gulf War came, we had a chance to see whether we had done that well. And if you remember, they shipped 50,000 body bags to Southwest Asia because they were anticipating those number of casualties. But we had a war, an air war that lasted 17 days, using all these new systems. And we had the Army re-equipped with the kinds of things that Denny Reimer talked about. And so after 3 days, when the Army engaged in a tremendous battle with the land forces, we ended up with a victory with less than 300 casualties, where they were anticipating 50,000. So we found ourselves, that was the legacy. We went into the war with the wrong stuff. We saw we needed it. We ended up with an A-10. We ended up with an F-15. We ended up with an F-16 and an F-14. So here we are again in history. And we're in another one of these times where we come out of this long war on terror, and we're now looking at an existential threat. And I must applaud our current leadership, particularly our Secretary of the Air Force with his 7 operational imperatives, because they're trying to make sure that we go into the next war, that it's not equipment, and it's not training, and there are no sanctuaries. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Thad Alan here, former Commandant of the Coast Guard. When the conflict in Vietnam started, my father was a chief damage controlman in the Coast Guard, and we lived in the Bay Area, and he supervised explosive loading out of Port Chicago and the Naval Weapons Station. A job that the Coast Guard started there and then was on the receiving end in South Vietnam to make sure the explosives and munitions were handled properly. And I was a sophomore in high school, 1964. That same year, the first POW was captured. It was not sent home until 9 years later. And the anniversary we celebrate this year, the 50th anniversary, is also the 50th anniversary of Operation Homecoming. From 1964 to 1973, if you can imagine that, what those folks went through, and to echo some comments that were made out of that, especially at the urging of the spouses and the family members, we now leave nobody behind. We leave nobody behind. I'm going to talk about navigation a little bit because that was my role over there. I was commanding officer of a land transmitting station in northern Thailand. We had 5 stations in Southeast Asia, one near the demilitarized zone in South Vietnam, the other one on Kon Son Island off the Mekong Delta, and then 2 stations in Thailand. What we did was we broadcast an electronic signal, and based on the timing of the receipt of the signal, you could actually plot lines of position with the time differences you receive from the signals from the different stations. I only raised that because accuracy was very important, and we just talked about the air operations and the weapon systems are being used there. And we advertised down to around 3 to 4 meters when we got it right, but sometimes that wasn't enough for what we were trying to do over there with our tactical operations, with our aircraft and our armament. The Coast Guard's role in Vietnam mirrored somewhat with the Navy. And Admiral Mullen talked about naval gunfire support and Operation Market Time, which we had Coast Guard units integrated into the naval forces over there. We also involved in explosive loading, as I said. We even had pilots that were deployed with the Air Force Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Service, and actually lost a pilot trying to do a recovery in Laos for a classified operation whose body was not recovered until about 8 years ago and given a proper burial at Arlington Cemetery. I'd like to focus for a minute on Operation Market Time, and that was the attempt to interdict. And you heard earlier, we didn't stop it at the source of the supply chains, so we had to find everybody on the water. And if you think about it, the ability to do that requires you to board vessels in high-risk situations. And the Lieutenant JGs and the junior officers and the list of people that were doing that in Operation Market Time 10 years later would be the commanding officers of cutters that started encountering trawlers with multi-ton loads of marijuana in the Caribbean. The legacy of Operation Market Time in the Coast Guard was the evolution of the capability and capacity to professionally board at sea and be both a military force and a military constabulary force. That mission extends today with the 5th Fleet in Bahrain, and then most recently there was a major seizure of ammunition in the Straits of Hormuz that was done jointly by the Navy and the Coast Guard. As a result of that, I believe there is no finer law enforcement on the water boarding interdiction agency in the world than the United States Coast Guard, and I was proud to lead them. We also were involved in riverine ops that allowed us to take part in the riverine ops operations in Colombia and the headwaters of the Andes, where they were moving cocaine products later on. And everything we did migrated to a new mission by taking the skills we had and transferring them over. But I'd like to talk about navigation just for a second. Loran was the best we'd ever had when it was created. But there was a young man that graduated from the Naval Academy that then joined the Air Force because they didn't have an academy yet. And his name was Lieutenant Colonel Brad Parkinson. Some of you may know him. He was given the challenge in the early 70s to put 5 bombs in the same hole in Vietnam. And as a result of his efforts, we're also experiencing the 50th year anniversary of the establishment of the GPS program, which today is a gold standard around the world for not only supporting military operations but civil users as well, which is emulated by every major power and the European Union right now. So my part over there was to keep a signal on air, and if we're off air for more than 15 or 30 seconds, I got a call from an Air Force general chewing my butt. And our goal was to provide the support. Ultimately, we stayed beyond 1973. Because the military forces had been removed from Vietnam, we converted our 2 stations that were there to civilian contractors, and the stations in Thailand remained staffed by military personnel. It remained that way until the South Vietnam was overtaken by the North Vietnamese forces. And in the spring of 1975, as they advanced on Saigon, we evacuated the station near the DMZ, and just hours associated with the evacuation of the American Embassy in Saigon, we pulled our people out of Con Son Island. We remained on air to support the operations to recover the Mayaguez in Cambodia. Some of you may remember that. But ultimately went off the air, and I was the last commanding officer of my station. We shipped the equipment back, and I turned the real property over to the Thai Army. I would just like to add my personal thanks to those that have already been said by everybody here for the sacrifice, the duty displayed, and the enduring thanks the American people have for what everybody did there. Very, very hard, and it's reflected in how we do things today, and we're a much better Coast Guard. We're all a much better service, in my view. We're taking the lessons learned there and converting them over and doing our jobs better today than we ever had in the past. So, thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'd be remiss in pointing out a clear and exemplary example of civilian control. We were supposed to have General Jack Sheehan, United States Marine Corps, and the former Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic here to represent the USMC. But on Monday, he received a subpoena to testify in a civil trial in Henrico County, Virginia today. So in perfect example of civilian control, the United States Marine Corps is missing. That's the way it is. And before I open the floor for questions, we got a little time. I got one thing I'd like you gentlemen to comment on. Recent survey says that less than 19% of the American youth are willing to serve time in the United States military today. What do we do? Admiral?
It's a huge concern. In the last, I would say, 20 years, there's been this focus on the roughly 25 to 30% of young people are qualified to come in the military. But we've actually we've had that as a limiter, if you will, for some time, and we know how to recruit and bring people in with respect to that. What has happened in the last few years is the influencers are telling their kids not to come. So the moms, the dads, the coaches, the pastors, the community leaders, et cetera. I don't have, we do go through these cycles, and I don't have a perfect answer, but I think it is really to make sure we're just not talking to ourselves, and we're actually out in the country talking to the influencers in the communities, focusing on the benefits, the changes we've all seen with young people when they come in the military, the opportunity to serve, see the world, grow up, create a path for a future, to get an education, to get training, the kinds of things that we all know. But that's at least, that's one aspect of it. The other is, and it really concerns me greatly, if you've looked at recent polls, I think it was last year, the military had been, and Denny Reimer talked about this. I mean, we all worked pretty hard back through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s to bring the military back. We were not a highly respected institution when we fought in Vietnam or when we came out of that. And then we've been at the top or near the top for decades. Last year, we fell from the most trusted institution at some 70% down to 55%. That's an alarming drop to me. And I think a lot of that has to do with the politicization here in Washington of everything, including our military. And for our leaders now, and they have had a load because of the political environment throughout the country, but certainly here, they just have to work that much harder to make sure we stay out of the political fray, including at the right moment and the right time, walking away from it. Just saying it's too much. I am not gonna be politicized by you, and send them that message. They have to have that courage to do it. But sort of those are two factors anyway. I'm sure there are others, but those are two that concern me.
Any other gentlemen? General Reimer?
Could I just make a comment? I agree totally with the chairman on that. I think there's a couple things here. One is that the politicization of the military, quite frankly, we have to be careful on that. I've always seen George C. Marshall as the example of how to do it. He was the most trusted individual during World War II. He never got involved with politics. FDR talked to him one time about going into Normandy and leading that invasion. And he said, "George, I know you'd like to do that." And Marshall didn't say anything. And FDR came back and said, "But if you do that, I'll sleep less well at night." And Marshall said, "Whatever you say, Mr. President." So we need people like that. And I think the second thing is we need to look at the duties of the people. I'm a big believer in universal service. I think people ought to pay a year's worth of service or whatever amount. You set the limit. But let's get people involved in saving this country and giving a little bit of skin in the game. I think having the universal service is something we all ought to be looking at.
It's interesting that some of the think tanks in this town have picked up on your question, Lynn, and Aspen Institute's creating a seminar in Colorado this summer where they've always focused on K through 12 education. But the civics part of what we teach our young kids, if it's not happening at home, who's teaching it? And what the responsibilities are for young people. So I think you'll see a groundswell of other organizations believing, as Adm Mullen and General Reimer, and I'm sure General Fogleman and Adm Alan will feel, we got to get back to our basics.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you. Admiral?
I think Admiral Mullen eloquently described what I would call an intergenerational loss of propensity to serve. And we got to figure out some way to get that back. I can tell you, under the right circumstances, this stuff works. And while there weren't military operations in my career, I had to handle 2 major disasters under 2 different presidents of 2 different parties. The first was Hurricane Katrina, and the second one was a Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I was successful at both, but for the exact same reason that was mentioned. Nothing I did was politicized. It wasn't they didn't try. But you got to hold your ground, and ultimately, in my personal relationship with both presidents, they reaffirmed that they wanted me to fix the problem and leave the politics to them.
Thank you. Got time for a couple of questions. Darrell, you got one?
Gentlemen, thank you. I'm a 3-tour veteran myself of Air Force, proudly so. First of all, to Admiral Allen, I want to thank you for the LORAN system. We had some of our OV-10s modified, and they were carrying the LORANs, and we had laser designators that would talk to them. It was so accurate, we had to correct maps. Is that good? Gentlemen, in listening to your presentations, of course, this is fascinating, but I only heard one of you use the word Laos. When I was over there in Southeast Asia in my 3 tours, I flew in South Vietnam, I flew in Laos, I flew in Cambodia, and I came out of Thailand. Did we make a mistake by not realizing, as the North Vietnamese did, that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was key and critical to doing that war, and did we make a mistake by not making that one of our priority efforts?
Well, I spent a lot of time as a Misty fastback over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and I think that people realized, what a vital artery that was in terms of bringing material from. But I can tell you how difficult it was to try and interdict stuff once it got through Magia Pass. Recently, the North Vietnamese archives they're being unclassified or declassified, and there was actually one period of time where we closed the trail. We closed it with a B-52 strike in Magia. And these records that they come out and talk about, it put the fear of God into them. They thought, but we never followed. First of all, we didn't know it. We didn't know that we had closed it, and we didn't know they had this fear. And so this was a case of, if you want to shut off the flow of supplies, do it at the port. If they can't bring them in, they can't send them south. Once they got through Magia, as you know, it wasn't one super highway down through there. It was stuff in the jungle. Before it was over, they had pipelines down through there. They had trellises that they used for foliage. So, no, I think that that's a part of the war. And, the Army SOG, they had people over there watching those trails. I know you guys in the OV-10 business were working with them all the time. It was a screw up because we allowed them to get the supplies down that then allowed them to concentrate on things like TED of 68. And again, I think TED of 68 is one of those things where it was a tremendous strategic loss for the North Vietnamese if you go read what's come out of their archives. But it was misinterpreted here in America. We lost a lot of Americans in that battle, but we won the strategic fight there, and it put off the collapse for a longer period of time. So one of the things that we didn't talk about here is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and the importance of that as we go through this, and what new sensors have done for us to help in that area. And now we're going forward into an environment where we're talking about cyber warfare, we're talking about the kinds of things that get inside systems. And I think these are going to be critical as we go forward. So I don't know whether I've addressed your question or not, but I can still name the delta points down through the trail for you. And
Yeah, let me just add on top of that, because of that, not that I was involved in Laos or Cambodia at the time, but as chairman, and people criticize me for this, but I was in Pakistan during the Afghan war. I made 27 trips to Pakistan. Really, the main reason was because it was a safe haven for the Taliban leadership, and was pretty convinced that, based on Vietnam, that we're not going to win this thing if they're allowed to exist in that environment, and pushed very hard to try to get and Pakistan's a country with a lot of problems, believe me. I can go on and on with respect to that, but it was that legacy, quite frankly, that drove me there to see if I could make a difference to somehow shut down that safe haven for the Taliban leadership.
Yes, I'm Brian McMahon. I'm with Virginia State AFA. Admiral Allen's comment about Loran C brought this question to me because I was reading through after-mission reports from VMO 6 in Vietnam, and they used the military grid reference system, which is basically polar coordinate type stuff. And I was just wondering, what other service used this military grid reference system in their planning for targets?
I think there is a place for it. I don't know if you knew, it was visible to you in the public, but the search and rescue operations following the landfall of Katrina were rather haphazard. Coast Guard units were self-directed, and we saved 30,000 people in a week, but it wasn't because of command and control and unified effort. When Rita came ashore about a month later in Lake Charles, Louisiana, we established a grid system because if you're trying to respond after a disaster, there could be somebody out there that needs assistance that can't communicate. Unless you're covering everything, you don't know if you've got a requirement out there to support somebody. And the issue has been to integrate that into the national response system and how we actually deal with civil authorities and responding to disasters. There is a place for it, and it does add utility and value when you're in an ambiguous situation and you don't know if people have communications to be able to contact you.
Maybe one more. Okay, well, I got it. What is the significant change you see when we allowed women in combat? Women in combat. How did that change your service?
Well, I think it brought challenges as well as great assets or great strengths. When I was CNO, this was probably 3 or 4 months into the job, I was asked to come over and give a young E3, who happened to be a woman, a Silver Star. So this kind of got my attention because Silver Stars are obviously pretty special in terms of what you go through. And when I read the citation, this gal was, pretty petite. She'd been a driver on one of the roads in Iraq and gotten blown up with her chief, E7, as well, who got blown up and was pretty badly hurt and was about 30 feet away from the vehicle. She took out her weapon and destroyed a bunch of bad guys, crawls out, picks up this guy that probably was twice her weight, and dragged him back into protection, and he lived. And that's why she got the Silver Star. So that's not every story. I think all of us who've been around for a while knew in the Navy, we had women on ships very early in the 70s. And so in some ways we were ahead of the other services and the other skill sets, but we all went through some challenging times. But my own experience is that they bring an awful lot to bear. They are in so many ways a great talent. they're open. Obviously, it's open to every opportunity right now, and I think at some point in time, there's going to be a woman SEAL. Now, there are a lot of former SEALs that would, roll over in their grave thinking that's going to happen. But I'm telling you, 1987, I was coming out of 05 Command, and I went to Newport, where the Navy surface community has our school, young ensigns coming up before they go to sea. And one Saturday morning, the whole group of them were out getting ready to run a 5K or a 10K, I can't remember. And this young gal was at the back before they were going out to the starting line, and they were all getting warmed up, and she just dropped down, did 100 push-ups, and then, was ready to run. Now, I'm in the class of 68 at the Naval Academy. It was a big deal to do the number of push-ups in your class, and somehow I got through that. I think I used to be able to do 68 push-ups when I was that age. So the physical aspect is changing. Certainly the mental acuity and what women bring to the force is extraordinary. I fought a long time in my own Navy to get women in submarines. There were no physical limitations there, other challenges, but young people understand that. It was us old guys that didn't understand, that they couldn't figure out how to live together in such close quarters, which they can and they have. So I've been very supportive, and I also think it's really important for America. One of the things that I worry about, maybe we'll close on this, and it's controversial. I agree with Denny, universal service. I'm a 2-year guy, not a 1, just because I think you get a lot more in 2 than 1. But I worried when I had that chairman's job, there were a couple things. We were sitting around with President Bush in January. He had a meeting of 16 4-stars, so the chiefs and the combatant commanders, and there was a pause there in the middle we had an hour with him, and Secretary Rumsfeld said, Mr. President, I don't know if you know this, but 15 of the 16 4-stars sitting here have kids in the military. And that sort of, lit off in my head. This is 2006, so I started tracking that, and it's stunning how many young men and women come from military families, officers and enlisted. They like it, they respect it, they've seen the life, they made those decisions. But the downside of that is, we become a class unto ourselves. And to the degree we do not represent America, I worry greatly that we will not be supported as an institution across the board, quite frankly. And that's just one example. So the aspect of both women here, but also across all minority groups as well, is really important. And we've made a lot of progress on that side, more on the enlisted side than we have on the officer side. But I think we need to represent the country, and we will be a much stronger military as a result of that. And it really it does, however, bring its challenges.
Thank you, sir. One more round of appreciation for our panel. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Len Bernamani. I'm the chairman of the Air and Space Force's Vietnam 50th Anniversary Committee. But I'd now like to introduce our real chairman, Bernie Scotch, who would like to present a chairman's coin to each of our members of the panel. Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.